I'm Sherry Krieger, and I just really want to welcome you to our 10th annual Mental Health Faith Council Conference. And this is hosted by NAMI of Greater Toledo's Mental Health Faith Council, which is a group of folks, professionals and faith leaders and caregivers of those living with mental illness, whose goal really is to break the stigma of mental illness, particularly in our faith communities, and to bridge the gap between treatment and mental illness and issues of spirituality, and really highlight the intersection of mental health and faith. So that's our goal. And we meet on a regular basis and host this conference annually on different topics. And given that 2020 has been such a very, very different year, we thought this issue of ambiguous loss was very timely. I have the distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker. This is Carla Dahl. She is a professor of congregational and community care at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. She has trained therapists and clergy for quite a few years, since 1993, and has private counseling and consulting practice where she works with individuals and groups and families around issues of grief and loss and spirituality. She's studied the effects of ambiguous loss for 30 years and has co-authored several chapters of how to support individuals and families in dealing with stressful experience. And so again, we think this is a pretty timely topic. And Dr. Dahl, we just thank you so much for being with us today. So take it away, and I know you're going to open us with some devotions.
Thank you, Sherry, and welcome everyone. Thank you for bringing me to Ohio this way. This is such a strange upside down time for all of us, and it has its limitations, but it also means we can gather in new ways with people that we wouldn't otherwise be able to see. So I'm looking forward to this morning and tomorrow morning. And because it's such a strange upside down time, I wanted to start our time together with just an invitation to some rest in the mess. This is a blessing from Jan Richardson's work, and it's called Blessing in the Chaos. I think you should be able to see it. So you can either listen and just sit back, or you can read along, whatever suits your soul best. Blessing in the Chaos. To all that is chaotic in you, let there come silence. Let there be a calming of the clamoring, a stilling of the voices that have laid their claim on you, that have made their home in you, that go with you even to the holy places, but will not let you rest, will not let you hear your life with wholeness, or feel the grace that fashioned you. Let what distracts you cease. Let what divides you cease. Let there come an end to what diminishes and demeans, and let depart all that keeps you in its cage. Let there be an opening into the quiet that lies beneath the chaos, where you find the peace you did not think possible, and see what shimmers within the storm. Read that last part again. Let there be an opening into the quiet that lies beneath the chaos, where you find the peace you did not think possible, and see what shimmers within the storm. May there be moments of shimmer for you today, and that you will hear some of the peace that's underneath all this chaos. Well, I'm hoping that today and tomorrow we will have some conversation about how to understand something that is such a common dynamic in our human experience. We'll talk about ambiguous loss, talk about what it is and what it isn't, how we can look for it in the stories of people that we work with and in our own lives. And then tomorrow in particular, we'll talk about some research-based, theoretically coherent ways of responding to ambiguous loss as people who are accompanying those who experience it. And again, I always am mindful of the fact that we all have our own histories of ambiguous losses, and they may not be past, they might be very present. So knowing that, that's one place where perhaps you'll see some shimmer or find some peace beneath the chaos, and to be able to sit with that a little bit. So if that means you get distracted from what we're talking about on the outside and your inside is doing some reflection and contemplation, that's all right. You have slides and you have the recording and you can catch up another time. But listen, I would invite you to listen for the invitation that is there for you as you think about living into and with ambiguity well. So let's start with some history about what we're talking about here. Again, I'll share. The concept of ambiguous loss was developed by a professor at the University of Minnesota named Pauline Boss. I had the incredible good fortune of being randomly assigned to Pauline as my first year advisor in my doctoral program back in 1987. And I've worked with her since then, written with her, and still meet with her every couple of months, at least before the pandemic, with a group of 4 or 5 people, who think about how to think well about ambiguous loss and how to help well about ambiguous loss. Pauline has a number of books that are, I think, really useful for both people who are experiencing ambiguous loss and those who are helping people who are experiencing ambiguous loss. And I have 3 of them listed here on this slide. The first is Ambiguous Loss. It's kind of the primary explanation of ambiguous loss, how to live with unresolved grief. The second one is Loving Someone Who Has Dementia, which is a fast growing kind of ambiguous loss, 50 million people worldwide with dementia and growing. And then the third one is intended more for helping professionals, clergy, therapists, social workers, ambiguous loss and resilience, and being able to think about, man, that is a touchy button, to think carefully and well about how we approach supporting people who are attending to ambiguous losses. So those are some resources you have. I think Sherry emailed you a resource list that's much more extensive. There's a website, ambiguousloss.com, and that's listed on that resource list, and a number of writings by Pauline and others, along with a section of research reports that have been accumulated in the last several years. People around the world are looking at ambiguous loss from all kinds of cultural perspectives and in a variety of situations. So take a look at the resource list. It won't be, I doubt very much that any of you will search out all of those resources, but there'll be something in there I think might be helpful as you think about learning more about ambiguous loss. The University of Minnesota has also started an online ambiguous loss certification training. And so that's at that website, ambiguousloss.com. You can find information about doing that. It's a self-paced online program. So how did this concept start? Pauline, when she was a graduate student in the 70s in Wisconsin, was invited into doing family therapy with a group of psychiatry students. And they invited her because, first of all, they had no women on the team. And secondly, because she was specializing in family therapy, not the internal intra-psychic stuff that the psychiatry students were attending to. So Pauline noticed that when the family groups would come to the therapy center, most often it would be the mother and the kids. And the father would say, this isn't something I can take time off work for. This is really something my wife takes care of. And so Pauline started thinking about what she called father absence in family therapy. And her advisor said, you know what, it's too small. You're going to find more that you'll need to think about. And so she started instead thinking about just the absence and presence discrepancies in families. and came up with this concept of ambiguous loss. So what is it? What are we thinking about? Well, there are two types. The first type of ambiguous loss has to do with leaving without saying goodbye. Okay, so there's physical absence, person left physically, but psychologically is still present. And we don't have information about that absence. We don't know, is it going to be prolonged? Is it permanent? Is this person safe? Are they dead? So that sense of physical absence with psychological presence emerged, first of all, in Pauline's research with families who had a military member missing in action. Okay, so physically gone, psychologically very present. And the stress of that is that we don't know how to continue as a family because we don't know where this person is in our family. That makes sense? So the struggle is, how do we rearrange our family interaction, either keeping this person present in our decision making and our life together, or kind of closing them out. So leaving without saying goodbye, stressful for families. And it's also stressful for other kinds of human systems. You know, if there's faith community where there's a person, maybe a leader who has suddenly stopped coming to the meetings of the faith community, but you don't know why. There's even a temporary sense of discrepancy between, are they here or are they not here? If you have a work group with a colleague who has agreed to take on some tasks and suddenly isn't doing it, are they here or are they not here? Are they part of us or not part of us? And that discrepancy causes stress for systems. So leaving without saying goodbye, physically not here, but psychologically here. The art there is the Prodigal Son painting by Heishi, the beautiful, wonderful artist who does so many, captures so much emotion in his paintings. And this picture, the Prodigal Son, reflects the ways in which in the story in the New Testament of the prodigal son leaving home, but still very present to his father and apparently to his older brother as well. And also the family being present to the younger son who had left, thinking about his family, his father, his older brother, and even though he wasn't present with them. So that's the first kind of ambiguous loss. In researchers' words, they call it type 1, but you don't need to think about it that way. It's just, this is the physical absence, psychological presence. The second kind of ambiguous loss, the type 2 kind of ambiguous loss, is saying goodbye without leaving. So here we have psychological absence and physical presence. They're still here physically, their body is here with us, but psychologically, they're not present to us. So this is another discrepancy. And this emerged, this addition to the ambiguous loss theory emerged with research into families who had members with dementia, in particular Alzheimer's, that the person physically was here, but psychologically was leaving, and then eventually at some point seems to have left psychologically. So again, the question emerges, how do we keep this person in our family psychologically, even though they're not here psychologically? So how do we make decisions? How do we assign tasks and so on? We'll talk more about that in just a bit. But that second kind of ambiguous loss is also really stressful for a system. A person seems to be here, but they're not. Okay. What I'd like to take some time to do really quickly is to have Sherry put you into some lightning round groups. Welcome home. I want to take just a couple of minutes to have you offer from your groups one or two examples of the kind of loss that you were talking about. So we'll start with groups 1, 3, 5, 7, 9. And if you just, somebody from each group would just unmute and give us one or two examples that you came up with of the kind of losses. In this case, the physical absence, psychological presence. So who from group 1 could offer a couple of examples?
Okay, I will. We had military families, COVID patients, those who may be in prison.
Okay, thanks. Let's try to get a couple more from group 3.
Death for a young child. We have dementia, runaways, given up for an adoption,
Ooh,
or
Thank you.
go out for milk and never come back.
Oh, yep, happens. Group 5, examples.
we had brain disorders or something such as schizophrenia involved. We also mentioned getting back to reality from addiction, and the person is physically not there yet, but emotionally the family is worried about them, but they're also feeling the loss of the drugs.
Okay, thank you. Group 7, a couple of more examples.
One of the areas would be maybe abortion. We had a lot of the ones that have already been stated.
Yep. Thank you. Group 9, anything left on your list?
Hi, Sonia.
Covered.
Pardon?
Everything's been covered, but we did have work like for couples that are married and maybe work in different city and or states. And then we also had school, first time parents when their child go away to school.
Okay. Thank you. Great list. How about the second kind, psychological absence with physical presence? And some of you have referred to some of those situations in the first list. What else did you come up with, group number 2?
Hi, we had, well, your example of dementia along with people that are battling substance abuse issues, where they're in the home, but certainly not focused on the family. Severely mentally ill. So not only psychotic disorders, but a deep depression, bipolar.
Thank you. Group 4?
I'll share, we just added to that traumatic brain injury, people who are in long-term treatment centers, maybe even people with COVID right now.
Also
Thank you.
mothers with postpartum depression,
Great.
teenagers sometimes.
Group 6?
We talked about the people that would be in a coma would be one. We mentioned several things like, have already been mentioned. Dementia, basically using substance abuse, drugs, whatever. Those were the main things.
Thank you. Group 8, any more?
We had also substance abuse, but also like maybe somebody's having an affair still with the family and the family doesn't know, but they're psychologically not really with them.
Yeah.
Also like anyone with distant relationships in the family.
I'm sorry, that cut out a little bit. Say it again.
Oh, and anyone with like distant relationships
Yeah.
within the family for various reasons.
Uh-huh.
And then maybe somebody who has a serious illness, they may be physically with you, but psychologically they're not really still in it.
Thank you. And so are we on group 10?
So
So we had a lot of the same ones. Just a few specific examples that we came up with were working parents that are coming home after working long days and exhausted. They're still there, but maybe not engaging. And then also just parents that learned different styles from maybe trauma in their past, and they just grew up with disengaged parents. And so they're kind of passing that along too, as they're physically there, but just not emotionally involved in their children's lives.
Mhm. Great examples. That's such great work to think through these realities that are around us, sometimes the ones we're living in. And a couple of things that didn't come up in the list were things like natural disasters. We have watched the hurricanes sweep into Central America, for example, a couple of times in a week, and we sometimes don't know if a person is dead. They're missing, but we don't know the facts of their disappearance. Things like 9/11, a huge cultural experience that said we remember the pictures after 9/11 on the fences of all the pictures of loved ones saying, "Have you seen my husband? Have you seen my child?" That long-term uncertainty about the facts of that. In fact, I think it was maybe 2 years ago that only the 1600th person's remains had been identified from 9/11. And so that left, about 1,200 people who we still didn't have clear information about. And each time a family member would be notified that your loved one's remains have been identified, there would be this strange response of, oh, it's final. We kind of thought it was true, but we also wondered maybe they'd come through the door one day. And so that response of what happens with the lack of certainty, the lack of clarity about information, we hold out hope sometimes for the long-term likelihood. So those natural disasters, the human-made disasters, out-of-home care, over-the-road truckers, we have all kinds of situations. And like that last example of your home as an exhausted parent, but you're not home, there but not there. My daughter was in first grade when I started my doctoral program, and she came home with these fascinating first grade stories, with all the details. They take a long time to tell about what Jimmy did and what then Leona did. And so I would, because I was a really good mom, I would listen carefully to those stories and all the details. And she said at one point, "Mom, you're not listening to me." And I said, "Yes, I am." She said, "No, I can tell because you say, 'oh,' in that fakey voice." And she was exactly right. I did say, "oh," as a way to keep her talking, just keep going, honey, I got to think about this paper I'm writing. And that kind of physical presence, but psychological absence, if it's on the long term, okay, this discrepancy of ambiguity in the long term is when it becomes particularly hard to manage, because we don't have a way to get clarity about what is the case, what's really the case here. Is this person here or not here? So the examples that you've come up with, these wonderful examples that each hold within them stories of people that say, here's my experience of not knowing about my loved one. Is my partner here or not here? And then is my child here or not here? How do I come to terms with this ambiguity? So we're going to talk all morning about how ambiguity is the culprit. We should have sweatshirts or needle-pointed pillows or something that we could sell that would say ambiguity is the culprit, because we have to remember that it's not a human failing to be troubled by ambiguity. Our brains like to have things clear and compartmentalized. We work more efficiently that way. So to hold things that are not clear and don't fit into a compartment is problematic for us. Any questions at this point about the kinds of ambiguous loss that we're talking about? Yes.
So I just now remembered, I have a friend who had a husband and raised 4 children, and he was 3 months gone on some kind of a ship and 3 months home. And as I think about what she shared about their family dynamics, it's like he fits both. Yeah. Their family fits both, because when he was with them, he was constantly thinking about what he was missing with his crew. But then when he was gone, that just came in my mind. I know how hard it was for that family to have 3 months to have a dad home and 3 months to have a dad gone.
Yeah.
And it was probably equally hard for him too.
Yeah. Great example, Cynthia. Thank you. Other questions or observations? I can't see you all, so you'll have to just unmute and start talking or put a question in the chat.
I think the current politics is also something that I'm really struggling with personally, and I know it's affecting a lot of other people.
And can you say in what way you're seeing the ambiguity there? It's kind of obvious, but go ahead and say it.
Just wondering what is going to happen on January 20th, and how much more of this painful not knowing what's happening in our country is going to happen before then, until then.
Yeah, again, it's a communal kind of stressor that we are holding the uncertainty, and uncertainty is a challenge for all of us.
I was just thinking with the whole political, the debates, I think for me, there's a loss of not knowing where I can engage meaningfully. It all seems like such chaos. So I feel like I have to step back so much, and it feels like a loss.
Yeah. Again, a really helpful example of the impact that ambiguity has on us, that the sense of withdrawing and being confused. I don't know what to do about this, kind of a sense of helplessness. You'll note in the chat too an example of parents who abduct their children, so parental kidnapping. The examples, you don't have to look at the news very long in a day or a week to see examples of this kind of ambiguous loss. We had a case here in Minnesota where about 30 years ago, a young boy was kidnapped. His name was Jacob Wetterling. And for 30 years, we'd turn our porch lights on and for Jacob, and his mother, Patty Wetterling, started the Center for Missing Children. And when the facts of the situation became clear eventually, it turned out he had been killed within an hour of being kidnapped. So that certainty, that was not available to the families and to the community to say, how do we hold this? So we just, people took different strategies, holding hope longer, deciding he must be dead by now because otherwise he'd be back. That the community struggles with that sense of lack of agency. What can I do? How can I engage? How do I hold this uncertainty? So, noticing around us what's happening. I'm sure in your communities, you have similar kinds of stories of people who have, disappeared or who represent this kind of, one of these kinds of ambiguous loss. So we have these two kinds of ambiguous loss. So there are some things that are helpful for us to understand about ambiguous loss that let us get a little more precision and clarity about what ambiguous loss is and does. The first thing is the ambiguous loss is relational. It's not individual. Okay, it's relational. There's a disruption in the relationship. It certainly has individual impact, but it isn't an individual diagnosis, quote unquote. The loss is of an important relationship, and that could be relationship to a person. It could be relationship to a job. It could be relationship to a dream. But whenever that relationship is disrupted and we don't have the facts about it, then we are encountering this reality of ambiguous loss. So that's an important, it's not just that I feel confused, it's I feel confused because of a disruption in a relationship to something that matters to me. A second thing that we need to understand about ambiguous loss is that it complicates grief. It makes grieving difficult for a number of reasons. One reason is I don't always know what to grieve. Am I grieving a death? Am I grieving a desertion? Am I grieving something that's going to eventually return in some changed form? I don't know exactly what I'm grieving, and that makes it complicated. It also is complicated because we don't know when to grieve. You know, I don't know when I'm supposed to feel sad about losing my parent to dementia. Is it at the point of diagnosis? Is it at the point when I start seeing cognitive decline that is starting to require change in living situation? Is it, when do I grieve this loss of a child who is managing serious mental illness and not managing it very well? And so I don't have information about where they're living, about how their health is. I don't know if I'm grieving the loss of a child, or am I grieving the loss of this dream of a relationship with my child? What am I grieving, and when do I grieve it? It makes it complicated. And then we don't have always a lot of support from the people around us for our grief. You know, well, you can't be sad about that. You have to hold out hope. You have to trust that this is going to turn out all right. So don't grieve yet, or you're grieving the wrong thing. You know, there's not, you haven't lost a parent. Your parent is still here. But in many ways, I have lost a parent if they're not able to recognize me, if I am doing parenting of my parent, if I'm doing for them what they used to do for me, bathing them, changing a diaper, feeding them. That's a complication of grief. So it's not that we don't experience grief at several different places along the process. It's that we don't know exactly sometimes what we're grieving and how we should grieve it. Does that make sense?
Mhm.
We also need to understand, and this is a big one, that closure is a myth. Okay, we hear a lot of talk about closure is, really important for people. Why? What, as you think about what you define closure to be when you hear that, what do you think seems so appealing about closure?
It allows you to know how to grieve.
Okay, so then we have some certainty.
Yes, it gives you some knowledge as to what happened. I mean, some actual fact.
Okay.
Fact based.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, there's an end to it.
This brings an end to it?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
My mom felt that she didn't have closure when her my uncle was cremated versus shown for the funeral, because that's just the way she was raised. So it's kind of subjective. I think closure can be subjective as well.
Good point. Yep. Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people think that once they get closure, they can finally move on and will get better, but that's not always the case. You know, those feelings don't go away just because you know why or how.
Right.
I do think a ritual is very important, whether it's for a funeral or, let's say, in a situation like a divorce where someone gets together with, I'm going to use a woman, her friends, and celebrates the fact that, there is closure and she can move on.
Yep. So you can actually do those kinds of practices that help us make a transition.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
I think a lot of people feel like they're going to find some sort of relief for the pain that they're experiencing.
Yeah, if I have closure, then I won't hurt anymore. So that you've really described well the appeal of closure. And the tricky part with ambiguous loss is that we, even if we get clarity, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow, when we get clarity, the effects of the ambiguity aren't all erased. We have had relationship changes, we've had personal changes that come in the ambiguity, and those will persist sometimes. So closure implying that there is an end, or that there is a relief of the pain. There might be some sense of having certainty helps me know what to grieve when, and yet the ongoing nature of that grief persists, and there are some ambiguous losses that don't end. So the reality of living sometimes for a lifetime with uncertainty means that the pursuit of closure as the goal is misplaced. Okay, so it's not that we wouldn't like closure. It's not that it would be desirable. It just doesn't serve the purposes we hope it's going to serve. So the idea of closure being the goal of how to deal with ambiguous loss, let that one go. Let that one go. Closure is a myth. In fact, Pauline just emailed me last night and asked about a title for her newest writing, which is about ambiguous loss in pandemic and the myth of closure in a pandemic. So that this is a really key part of understanding clearly what ambiguous loss is. Questions about
Dr.
that?
Dahl, Pastor Dana had a question.
Yeah.
Did you want to ask your question, Pastor?
Yeah.
Oh,
I don't see a question. So if you see one, so go ahead and just unmute.
unmute. He's not unmuting. That's okay.
I'm good.
There you go. Oh, you went back off.
That's why I put my hand back down.
Okay. Just making sure we catch people.
Yeah, and please, if I'm missing, I have 3 pages of Zoom to go through to see you all, so I can't always see it. So don't hesitate to just unmute and ask. Did you have a particular question or observation? Okay.
I have a friend whose brother was murdered like 25 years ago. And the individuals that were responsible for the murder were caught and tried and convicted. And she has also commented that closure is a myth. Because in this instance, I think probably just because it was so senseless.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it was just a random murder for no reason. He and his girlfriend were murdered together. And just the senselessness of it has caused that closure to not really occur.
Sure. Thank you for that. It's a powerful example of the ways in which even getting the facts of a situation don't always provide the helpful kind of certainty, because why would that happen? Why them?
Right.
You know, the randomness and the senselessness, as you described, that keeps the ambiguity alive. There are still some facts that we don't have access to.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of the key part of ambiguous loss, is that there's something that we have lost, this disrupted relationship, and we don't have facts about it. We don't know why. We'll talk a lot more about that tomorrow, about the whole question of figuring out why. Any other questions?
You know, I was just thinking, I think I was like 13 years old, and we had a little dog called Bobo. And one day Bobo was just gone. And I remember during that time waking up and, you know, in the middle of the night thinking that I heard him and just following and going to find him. And all these years later, I still think I obviously know he's gone,
Yeah.
but how that stays with you.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Another powerful example of the persistence of the ambiguity. And so let go of the idea that just help people find closure. You know, we have this bad habit, not we on this call, but journalists have a bad habit of sticking a microphone in the face of somebody who's going through great distress and saying, so how do you think you'll get closure about this? And the response is kind of shock usually. In fact, one of the father of one of the persons who was shot, a young girl who was shot in the Sutherland, Texas church shooting, he was the pastor and his daughter was one of those killed. And a reporter asked him that, you know, how do you make sense of this? And he said, we don't. Right now, we don't. And just the raw honesty of, this isn't about finding closure. Don't ask me that. I was speaking last year in Iceland to a group of clergy and helping professionals, and mentioned that tendency we have to, you know, stick a microphone in people's faces, and they were aghast. They said that would never happen here. You would never find a journalist asking that kind of senseless, hurtful question. So, you know, we're kind of used to this idea that it's okay to ask people in great pain questions that will make us feel better. But that's the challenge of, again, accompanying those who are experiencing ambiguous losses. How can we stay present to the ambiguity and not push for something that isn't going to actually help, like closure?
We have a question in the chat. Is there any relationship between ambiguous loss and Kubler-Ross stages of grief?
Well, I think that's again, a very great observation and question. So those stages of Kubler-Ross is, the denial, anger, bargaining, grief, acceptance. Remember that those were identified by Kubler-Ross for people who themselves had received a terminal diagnosis. So that's that's where they become most useful. And they're useful if we remember that it's not a linear kind of process with compartments that we shut behind us. Oh, now I'm done with denial. Oh, now I'm not angry anymore. Okay, now I'll finish my bargaining. So with those two caveats, remembering that it's not about people who are grieving a person who has died, it's about the person who is dying, and that it's a very circuitous, messy process. Then I think the relationship comes with tending to the reality that the grief that happens in ambiguous loss. Again, we'll talk a lot about this tomorrow. There aren't stages in that same way. There are tasks, maybe is a better way to think about it. William Worden, W-O-R-D-E-N, has some great writing on the tasks of grief, which is a different approach than the stages of grief. And I think the tasks of grief that he identifies, like making the loss real and feeling the feelings of the loss and adjusting to a changed environment because of the loss and reinvesting energy, those fit well with ambiguous loss and the grief that comes with that, because there are things that we're doing at different points in time, and then we revisit them and do them some more. And again, tomorrow we'll talk specifically about those tasks that can be useful in building resilience, deepening resilience. So the relationship between ambiguous loss and Kubler-Ross's kind of approach is primarily that it's aimed at different audience. That rather than a person who is dying, it's aimed at the people who are around the ambiguity, who are around the loss of. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Any other questions? Okay, let me do one more thing and then we'll take a quick break. And this is to finish this idea about what we need to understand. Are you seeing the slide?
Yes.
Okay. Because I can't see what I can see. Let me fix this one time. Well, I can't get it up there. So let me stop sharing and say that the final thing we need to understand about ambiguous loss is that the goal of support is to strengthen resilience. Okay, the goal of support is to strengthen resilience. So it's not to figure out what is the certainty, what is the closure, where we can get closure, but the goal of supporting people and the goal of our own working with our own ambiguous losses is to deepen resilience. And that looks different sometimes with ambiguous loss than with other kinds of thinking about resilience, because the deepening resilience actually is, how do I train myself or support others in holding the ambiguity? That's the resilience comes in being able to live better with ambiguity. And the strategies that we'll talk about tomorrow are aimed at that. How do we find ways to tend to our well-being and the well-being of others when the ambiguity persists? Because again, sometimes it's going to be lifelong. Okay, so the tendency or the temptation as helping professionals, as we are around people who are experiencing ambiguous loss, can be, okay, my goal has to be to stop their pain or help them feel better about this. And the challenge really is to remind ourselves over and over, my work here is to help people deepen their resilience. Resilience not meaning they bounce back from it. That's a common, really shorthand view of resilience, but resilience being, how do I live well with what is? That means I have to be able to hold the ambiguity, which is going to lead us into being able to do both and thinking rather than either or. This person is either here or not here. They are both here and not here. And coming to terms with that is the invitation for us. Okay. So those are some things to clarify again, how we understand ambiguous loss with some nuances. Let's take a quick break and we'll come back and talk about what ambiguous loss isn't, so that we're doing some more definition work. Okay, welcome back. I encourage you to note the chat every now and then. Another great example of ambiguous loss, a person who's had a mastectomy, loses a body part. And that is, there's, with a person who has an amputation, about phantom pain, that there's a phantom limb experience. And that's an area that's just now beginning to be more heavily researched, is the personal ambiguities that we lose, and the ways in which lost abilities, lost body parts, lost dreams, those are internal kinds of ambiguities. And another area of newer research is the area of gender transitioning, both for the person transitioning and for their families. So keep imagining and listening into your own experience about examples, and feel free to add them to the chat. Okay, so any leftover questions about those nuances of ambiguous loss that we just were looking at?
I don't have a question, but I do want to say, Carla, that's a really great point that you brought up. I didn't even think of that. I have a trans son, and I can speak from experience that it was a very difficult transition for both of us, not only for him going through it, but for me as a mother, raising a daughter all of these years, and being excited to go prom dress shopping and get her hair done together and all of those girly things that you would do. And then all of a sudden now I have a son, and I've never had a son before. So that's a really great point that you bring up. I never thought of it as a loss. So great insight on that.
Good. Thanks for sharing your experience. This is, the gift of being in conversation about these kinds of human experiences, is that we hear each other's stories in ways that help our own make sense, and have some ways of naming some things. Okay, so we've talked about what ambiguous loss is and being a little nuanced about that. And I want to now look a little bit at what ambiguous loss isn't. So we talked about how it's relational, it complicates grief, closure is a myth, and resilience is the purpose. But there are some things that get lumped into in popular thinking about ambiguous loss that actually would be a distinction. One thing is, ambiguous loss is not synonymous with post-traumatic stress disorder, for a couple of reasons. It isn't that post-traumatic stress disorder wouldn't be a feature of some kinds of ambiguous losses. They may well be. But PTSD, first of all, is an individual diagnosis. And remember, we talked before the break that this is a relational thing. It's not an individual thing. So PTSD is talking about an individual experience that has relational implications. Ambiguous loss is describing a relational experience that has individual implications. So that's the first reason why it's not a synonym for PTSD. The second reason is that there's nothing post about ongoing ambiguous loss. We're still in it. And so to think about traumatic stress, it can be helpful, sure. But post-traumatic stress disorder, it doesn't have that key feature of being in the past. And the third thing has to do with the D in the PTSD, which is a disorder. Even with post-traumatic stress disorder conversations with people who've experienced combat stress, for example, it's not disordered to be traumatized by traumatizing events. That's normal. That's how we are created as humans. Similarly, it's not a disorder to be confused by ambiguity. So this point that I'm hoping you catch here is we need to normalize our responses to traumatizing and ambiguous things. Even in people who work with combat veterans, some of them are resisting calling it a disorder because, again, it's normal to be traumatized by being in a situation where your life is at stake and you're seeing your friends killed. That's not a disorder to have post-traumatic stress symptoms. So hopefully this point normalizes the responses to ambiguous loss, and it also re-emphasizes this is a relational thing, not an individual thing. Okay, so it's not a synonym for PTSD. Additionally, ambiguous loss isn't always associated with depression. And I mean here a clinical diagnosis of depression. It is completely likely and understandable, and again, normal, to experience grief and sadness with ambiguous loss. We would expect that. But in terms of a clinical diagnosis of depression, not necessarily. And some of this, those of you who work with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 5th edition, the DSM-5, have maybe noticed the switches in diagnosis around grief and depression, and the ways that bereavement has been in and out of that depression over the years. That talking about grief can be a long-term process, and to say that if it's lasted more than 6 months or more than a year, then it's problematic. It doesn't fit with ambiguous loss, because again, the ambiguity may continue for quite some time. So a person who is depressed about a loss may not be experiencing it as ambiguous. A person who is experiencing ambiguous loss isn't necessarily clinically depressed. That distinction makes some sense? A third thing, ambiguous loss isn't present in every catastrophic loss. Okay, now the example that one of you gave before the break about the young couple that was murdered, that's a catastrophic loss. And there's ambiguity about why that would happen. But there are other kinds of catastrophic losses that don't hold a why in them very easily. My mom, 27 years ago, was killed instantly in a car accident. And that was a catastrophic loss for me. It wasn't ambiguous. We knew exactly what had happened, when it had happened, where it had happened. And although I never saw her body because I was in another state, and the state of Wisconsin did an autopsy first and then she was cremated, that was catastrophic, but it was not ambiguous. Okay, so this is not, I don't want you to argue with people who say they have an ambiguous loss. No, you don't. No, you don't. It's not, you're not right about that. It's just for you to conceptually get a distinction between those things. If a person names their loss as ambiguous, don't argue with them. Just keep on working for deepening resilience. But some catastrophic losses are not ambiguous. They are still horrific. They are still traumatizing to us. But that is the distinction of, it's the ambiguity, it's the not knowing, not having access to the facts that it characterizes ambiguous loss. And then finally, ambiguous loss is not the same thing as ambivalence. Ambivalence, is holding these seemingly contradictory kinds of feelings about a particular thing. So, how is it that I can both want this to end and want it to keep going? I want my parents' battle with dementia to end, but I don't want to lose my parent. I want them to stay here. So those conflicting emotions, I'm angry with this person who's gone, and I'm in deep sorrow for this person who's gone, and I don't think those match each other. So ambivalence is actually the child of ambiguity. Okay. The ambiguity is the larger umbrella idea, the experience, and ambivalence comes as a result of that. I can't get clarity about this. Therefore, I have these mixed emotions. And part of what we'll talk about tomorrow is deepening resilience involves normalizing ambivalence, that it's perfectly understandable to have these conflicting emotions. The ambiguity itself creates such distress that the mixed emotions are almost inevitable. Those make sense? Any comments or observations about those distinctions?
I would just say, going back to Kubler-Ross and what I learned about her stages of grief, and they're not chronological. And I think that also speaks to this ambiguity and some of the things you've already mentioned, that they're not necessarily, even if we're normalizing, they come back to us and maybe not normal for a period of time, or in an instant, or with a flashback because we're in a similar situation for ourselves, our loved ones, or the people we're caregivers for.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. It's and part of that is what we see in the pandemic. The impact of the pandemic on these kinds of losses is that they do surprise us. They come out of the blue sometimes as an echo or a trigger. Thank you. There's really so little in life that is linear when you think about it. Even this whole idea of a baby learning to walk, that they roll around and then they crawl and then they pull themselves up and then they take a step and then they fall down and lose their balance and they learn to walk. And it's like, even that sounds like it's such a linear thing, but it's not when you watch it happening. There's lots of tentativeness and experimenting and exploring. So as humans, we really like the idea of stages, and that they go, they keep following each other. It gives us some, again, that certainty, the compartmentalization that our brains do so well. But if we bend in almost every case that I can think of with a stage theory, we need to bend it into a spiral, so that rather than thinking we just march through this, rather we experience it and then we revisit it again in another way, and we revisit it again later. And every stage model that I can think of in terms of human development and human experience really benefits from having that linear thing bent rather than thinking we march along.
Can a lot of losses begin as ambiguous because you don't know all the facts? And then once you learn the facts, it's no longer considered ambiguous loss?
Yep. Yes, it can. And that's a good point, that the nature of this kind of loss can change over time. And tomorrow in particular, we'll talk about what happens when there finally is clarity or certainty. Again, not closure, but clarity and certainty. And how does that continue on and to be a factor in our experience?
Before you gave the 4 examples, you said ambiguity is. Do you remember what you said?
In the previous slide?
During the slide. You said ambiguity is, and then I started writing down some other things and I forgot what you said.
Oh, in regard to this current one, what would it have been about ambiguity is the overarching concept, and ambivalence is the underneath that?
I think you said 1 or 2 words only.
Okay. Oh, that was brief of me.
They included the power.
You did say it's relational, not individual.
Yep. If you trace back in the slides in your handout, maybe you'll see something will spark
okay.
What that
Thank
was.
You.
But if it comes to you again, ask again.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions or observations at this point? Okay, then let me go back to share my screen. look who popped up. That's my grandson, who is ambiguously present to me these days. I haven't seen him for a long time. He lives far away, and I like him. So thank you for joining us, Guthrie. Okay, so how does ambiguous loss affect caregivers and families? And in this caregiver, I don't mean like a caregiver for a specific condition, but people who are offering care to those who have experienced the loss. And there are at least 3 different dimensions that are impacted by the ambiguity. One is that it blurs the family roles. Every system needs to know who's doing what, so having a sense of this is my job, this is your job, this is how we accomplish this, that gets shaken with ambiguous losses because we don't know the basic question of boundaries, which is who's in and who's out. That's a really critical question for any system, a family, a faith community, a work group, to know who's in and who's out. And I don't mean this in an excluding way that says you're not part of the family, like you see at weddings when the photographer says, okay, let's get the whole family up on the platform for a picture, and people are like, what are you doing up here? You don't belong here. It's not that in or out. It's not excluding. It's saying who is part of this group and how do they accomplish what the family needs to accomplish. So even if it's not explicitly laid out, family roles are taken on by members of the system, right? So in the olden days, back in early family theory, at least back in the 1920s or so, there was a theoretical perspective saying that there's a form the family should take, which is husband, wife, and the children born to the wife. That's pretty limiting kind of structure definition. And the function, who does what, at that point was named by theorists as, well, men do the instrumental roles in a family. They earn the money and do what needs to be done physically speaking, and women do the expressive roles in a family, which is the emotional, nurturing, supportive stuff. That theoretical perspective has fallen out of disuse in a lot of ways, especially around the structure question, because families can look very different than husband, wife, children born to the wife. In fact, even back at the time of the theory, it didn't fit very many families. My grandfather had his own mother and then 2 stepmothers. Doesn't fit that kind of description. But it wasn't because of divorce, it was because of death and childbirth. So in his time, the who's in and who's out had to be pretty flexible in terms of form and function. And so these days we have similar kinds of flexibility in defining families, right? That how we relate to each other is more helpful. As you're thinking about the families you work with, more helpful to think about how they define themselves as family and about how they relate to each other than what's the structure of the family. So when we think about supporting families and figuring out who does what, we focus less on what's the structure of the family and more on what's the interaction in the family. Does that distinction make sense? The structures and the functions? So although structure functionalism as a theoretical perspective has fallen out of favor mostly, it still surfaces in some pockets of political discussion. Here's who gets benefits, people who have this form of family. But the interaction piece is what matters to us as we're helping people navigate ambiguity. How do they relate to each other? Who's doing what in the family? And with an ambiguous loss, especially a person who is physically not present anymore when they were, who does what they used to do in the family? It takes some time to figure that out. How are we going to decide how to switch those roles? And that's time consuming. And it involves deeper levels of grief, sometimes levels of anger. I don't want to have to do this. I don't want it to be my job. we hear this as part of the grief journey for lots of kinds of losses, right? I have to learn new ways of being in the world because of this loss that I've experienced. With the ambiguity, it's complicated even further because we're not quite sure who's in and who's out. So am I temporarily taking over this task that this other person used to do? Or is this now mine? Am I this performing this role? Am I the person now who needs to earn income? And in the past, this other person earned income. Am I the person who now provides emotional support to kids who are launching when I relied on the other person in the family to do that more? Okay, so there's a blur to the idea of who does what. Questions about that one?
I just want to comment. I have a clear example of that. When I left for college, my sister, who was 6 years younger than I, thought she had to step in the role I had had in the family. And we didn't share that until we were adults, but I was shocked. Like, why would you take what I was doing?
Great example. And the thing about roles is that they so often are implicit. You know, we see what needs to be done and we step into that without being told to. Thank you for that example. Other questions about this impact? You know, you might hear of who's in and who's out with people who have a child who's run away and has been, you know, out of contact for a couple of years. Are they still in the family? Well, again, psychologically, yes. Physically, no. But what do we do about making decisions such as, should we move? You know, well, what if we sell the house and move? How will they find us? What was that movie, Castaway, with Tom Hanks, where he was on the desert island and had the friend with the volleyball? You know, him coming home, part of the predicament is that the family that was remaining had made decisions. Now, we might call that moving on, but that's a dangerous kind of phrase to use with ambiguous loss, because the definition of who's in and who's out and where we do our family, where we live, where we are located, it's not about moving on. It's about deciding how do we determine a course of action, knowing that we're still kind of back in the prior to ambiguity kind of family. Let me there's a thing in the ambiguous loss theory called the family gamble. And it's when one or more members of a family make a decision that, based on what we know, we're going to act as though we have clear information. Based on what we know, the fact that this person has been missing for 6 years, hasn't been in contact at all. Based on what we know, we're going to proceed as though that person is dead. An example of maybe a woman in her early 50s whose brother hasn't been in contact with the family for 6 or 7 years. And she says to her parents, you know what, it's time for us to just make a decision. We know that he's not living, so we need to change some of the legal stuff. We need to change power of attorney. We need to change executor of your estate, because he was supposed to be doing that, but he's not here anymore. So he's out, and who does what? I'm going to step into that. I think that would help us as a family. The parents might be at a completely different place, right? Who are saying, no, we have to hold the space for your brother. He may come back. We expect that. We hold out the hope. Well, this family gamble can create, as you can imagine, some real stress in the family when people decide differently about how to land on the gamble. But it does allow a system to move into decisions and move into the future, not moving on and meaning away from the relationship, but moving into what's next for them. And by having decided, this is how we're going to proceed. You can already guess that can be functional unless the gamble turns out to have been wrong, right? The brother shows up, and has the story of why he was out of contact and was missing, and wants to reclaim his place in the family and take back his roles. So when the gamble turns out to be wrong, that creates its own kind of stress. But there are some times when the gamble serves the family. There is one study quite a few years ago about patients who had end-stage renal disease and the family functioning around those patients. And that is a pretty clear diagnosis. It's not likely that there's going to be recovery from that. And the research found, this is one of the earliest things I learned about ambiguous loss, and it was shocking to me at the time. The research found that families that did the best, meaning they were able to function and make decisions and accomplish what they needed to accomplish, were those that closed out the patient with end-stage renal disease sooner in the process. Closed them out of decision-making, closed them out of conversations around what had to be accomplished as a family, unrelated to the patient's care, but regular family kinds of decisions. That was shocking to me because it felt like an abandonment, like a betrayal of the relationship, to say, you close me out when I'm close to death. And I couldn't imagine that. The research was not saying that's what a family should do. It was saying families that did that had less stress. Now, what do you do with that? What do you do with that observation that families who make this decision about who's in and who's out make a family gamble, closing a person out? How do you, as a care provider or as a company, deal with that kind of observation, that families do better when they close out, decide who's in and who's out of the family in that regard? Thoughts about that?
It's clear to me that it doesn't mean closing out is linear nor conclusive. Closing out could be just that umbrella, and then that family member may be still included in like 2 to 3 specific decisions. And maybe the family decides that in these areas, we're going to continue our decisions, but in these 3 ways, offering support, choice for a meal, this type of thing, they're included. So closing out doesn't necessarily also mean our very hope for exactingness.
Yeah, that's a great reflection of the both and. We can not have to do an extreme. Thank you. Other thoughts that occurred to you about this?
It would also help decrease the sense of family tension. So we know that there's like optimal anxiety and optimal ability to function with tension. So if you can frame that in, this is again part of your choice for resilience, so you can continue for the long haul in the best optimal ways, that framework could be helpful as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
I think it would help me to know what kind of decisions we're talking about. Having my father had end-stage renal disease, and I have a friend with a son with that. And I guess I need more of a specific example of what that looks like.
Because just add to your sentence there that because in your experience, the closing out, what? How would you finish that?
I'm not sure what kind of decisions, I guess, that we are talking about. We're talking about financial decisions. We're talking about, I don't know what decisions we're not including that person in.
Yeah.
It does feel like an abandonment to me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think so the kinds of decisions that revolve around resources, how are we going to use our money? How are we going to make decisions that affect the future with this person may not be a part of the future physically. Again, what the last phrase you used, it does feel like abandonment. This is an observation. It's not a prescription. Okay. So it's an observation that when a family says, let's come to terms with what is most likely, and and act accordingly, that the observers found that that let them function with a lower level of stress, not a lower level of sadness, but a lower level of stress. So that is not prescriptive. That is suggesting that you may be in contact with families who are doing this, kind of unconsciously doing this, as a way of managing the stress. They're making this family gamble. And so your awareness is, okay, this could have complications, both in the emotional sense of we're abandoning this person and in the sense of the disagreement within the family about what should be done. So it may well be that in a particular family's case, that fear of abandoning and the desire to be very present with all the way to the end they would say, we're not going to make that gamble. Our gamble is that we're not going to resolve it that way. We're not going to say, let's just go on and make our decisions about the future, even if it would mean we'd have less stress. It may be a moral issue. It may be an emotional issue. It may be a spiritual issue from the inside. And so I think that what matters for our work with people is to be able to say, even though something may reduce stress, that doesn't mean that the family's going to benefit from taking that course. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. My experience with my father, and that he was married to a woman who he was the caregiver for, is that he did this himself. He bet on a future without himself to make her life better.
Yeah, and when you hear the story of that with real people attached to it, it really holds then this sense of generosity and love rather than abandonment. The family gamble is not something that I think we as helpers want to push people toward. It might be a temptation, just decide one way or the other. But this is something that we can recognize as we listen to stories, that people are playing with this, that they're considering making this gamble, deciding, okay, it must just be done.
I was thinking it must be so difficult, so many people on the outside looking in, wanting to judge the decision that's being made, but trying to just support people and encourage them just in this, you're doing the best you can with what you got at this moment.
Yeah.
And that's hard.
Yes, the affirmation. And because, again, we talked about at the beginning, the judgment that comes when we're not grieving what people think we should be grieving, or that we're not grieving when people think we should be grieving. I think it's often our anxiety that pushes us to judge, those kinds of things. Sometimes I'm afraid also it's our arrogance, that we really do think we know better than people who are suffering or struggling. So this is where our self-awareness as helping professionals and caregivers is really important, so that we can know this is a part of our response and we can regulate it, ramp it down, that I don't need to live this person's life for them. I'm next to them.
I think I would feel like it's not my place to advise them or instruct them on how they should manage that situation, but rather to support them in whatever choice is right for them.
Yeah, and that's really beautiful. What I think for me, what helps me with thinking about ambiguous loss and the family gamble and so on, is that I can hear something in the story that I might have missed before. That I as they talk about their struggle, I hear, it sounds like they're having a disagreement about, some people say we should just decide and move ahead. And some people say, no, we can't do that.
An example might be, excuse me, when my mom was dying of breast cancer, my mom and her mom did not get along. They were like oil and water. And so when my mom was dying, she did not want my grandmother, her mother, to know. She hid everything. And personally, I didn't think that was right. I thought, and I even mentioned to my mom, what if I was dying and I didn't tell you? And she was, well, it's not the same situation, she said. Bottom line was, it wasn't my choice to make. It was her life. It was her illness. And And I had to respect that. And so as much as I wanted, as much as I felt like it, my grandma had a right to know, it wasn't my call. And I felt horrible about it, but I had to respect my mom's wishes.
That's a powerful story, again, of that accompaniment that we do, that we are not invited to leap into a person's life and take over. That really our work is about hearing carefully and hearing well, and asking good, curious, open questions with compassion. You know, not, well, don't you think you should? It ends with a question mark, but it's not a good question. It's not an open, honest question. Have you ever thought about, is not usually an open, honest question, but, you know, asking something that is really about, what is it like for you to hold this? What is it like for you as a person watching your mother and grandmother in this part of their story? What is that like? You know, that's where we are on sacred ground, I think, where we are hearing a person's story and have the privilege of being next to them in these profound places of life and death.
Yeah. And again, I asked my mom, how would you feel if the situation was reversed? You know, if I was sick and dying and I didn't tell you, and she says, well, we have an entirely different relationship. And then knowing that my grandma had no idea whatsoever. My grandma did not know anything about my mom's condition until after my mom had passed. And to see her at the memorial service, I could barely bring myself to even talk to her. I just felt so bad, but I had to respect my mom's wishes. I didn't agree, but the bottom line was it wasn't my place.
Which is a reminder of the ways that when we're dealing with grief, especially, there is very rarely a right solution, a right answer. There are possibles, and all those possibles mean there will now be the work of walking alongside your grandmother who's grieving in a particular way now. And so the work that we find ourselves doing changes as we are living next to and hearing well the story of someone else. So thank you for that.
Doctor, we have a question in the chat. So the discussion of inside and outside reminded me of the ambiguous loss I felt when parishioners suddenly stopped attending worship. How might ambiguous loss in one set of relationships affect ambiguous loss in other relationships?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's very real, that idea that somebody was here and they disappeared. You know, we may not have access to why they disappeared. And that impact on other relationships is a very real thing. We'll talk about at the end of the morning today about how losses trigger other losses, how we have echoes of our stories showing up in other places. And that brief answer at this point is, I think those reminders, those impacts on other relationships, that's a opportunity for deeper healing, more growth, and unfortunately that might involve more pain. But that reality that things get triggered in one place by other things that happen in other places, it's happening in the pandemic, you know, and that's what we'll talk about later this morning. The triggers that happen to us that are echoes of what's come before. Okay, so let me talk about another piece that gets affected by ambiguous loss of family dynamic, and that is the idea of family rules. That ambiguous loss changes family rules. Systems, all of systems use rules to function, right? It's the patterns that we have in place, the ways in which we know who does what and live out those roles, those happen along the lines of rules. And sometimes the rules, are explicit. You know, some of you would have fond or not so fond memories of explicit rules when you were growing up. You know, you have to be in by this time, or you have to do these chores, or you better not talk back. And those explicit rules have explicit consequences. If you break the explicit rule, then you're going to get grounded, or you'll lose some allowance, or you might get hit. But there are also implicit rules in systems. And those are the ones that we don't say out loud necessarily. They're the ones that we just know. And because they're implicit, the consequences are implicit. I don't know what's going to happen to me. Maybe the implicit rule is don't embarrass this family. Okay. I don't know what's going to happen to me if I embarrass this family, but it feels like it's pretty significant to my place in the family, to our connection. So breaking an implicit rule can feel more dangerous than breaking an explicit rule. But these rules that guide the system's interaction get complicated when there's an ambiguous loss, because especially when there are the rules about conflict, which is oftentimes increased around ambiguous loss, and decision-making, which can be frozen. So the rules about who knows what, who decides what, who gets to have input, who has final say, those rules get mixed up. They get challenged when there's ambiguity in the loss. So the rules about how we behave with each other, how we interact with systems outside the family, who we talk to, who we don't talk to, don't tell, the example you just gave about, don't tell my mother about my health. There's a rule there that the family is trying to navigate. And ambiguous losses complicate that way of understanding and living out the rules that we've been used to. So now is it okay to be really, really angry? Now is it okay to just put off decisions that we normally would have made, we used to make? What are the rules about how we behave with each other and the outside world? And are those different now because the person who used to enforce those rules is now missing, either physically or psychologically? The example that one of you gave earlier about the military family, where there's 3 months here, 3 months gone, 3 months here, 3 months gone, is a great potential for these family rule problems to emerge, because the person's here, then not here, here, then not here. And we have to re-navigate the kinds of expectations we have for each other when the person returns in, physically is back. So the blurriness happens around roles and around rules. We also have disruption of family rituals in it with ambiguous loss. Rituals are really, really powerful things. And we're coming up to the time of the year when a lot of us have a lot of rituals that we normally would practice. Maybe we won't be doing it in the same way with the pandemic, but the rituals are these almost nonverbal things that touch us at really deep levels. So a ritual can communicate who we are, what we believe, how we relate to each other. They can help us make a transition or mark a transition. Think about the rituals around a wedding. All the costumes and the props and the names for the parts of the people that people are playing, and both positive and negative names, bridezilla, but the ways in which we practice rituals as that couple participates in the ritual of the wedding ceremony. It marks a transition. It also makes a transition. At the end of the ceremony, that couple is something different than they were at the beginning of the ceremony, right? So it's a ritual is a really powerful kind of experience that does this multitude of things. And when ambiguity hits in the family, then we end up sometimes seeing rituals that had meant something to the family being disrupted. And disruption of rituals is unsettling at a really deep place to us. One of the questions that we ask is, what has gotten interrupted in the family ritual? What's been canceled? With the pandemic, we have these canceled rituals around death, where you can't have a memorial service that you normally would have expected to have, and perhaps the person who died had planned for it. We can't have Thanksgiving the same way. Those rituals have been interrupted or canceled. In the same vein, though, a disruption can happen with obligatory rituals. We have to do it this way. Everything else feels so crazy, we have to do this, and we start getting more rigid about the ritual, which means that it then can create, has a potential to create conflict and pain to the people, not rather than tending to the point of the ritual, which is connection, healing, celebration, and so on. So some of us have a kind of a mixed relationship with rituals. Some of us love it. Everything we've done once becomes a precedent, and it's a ritual for all time immemorial. Some of us resist ritual. It feels like, no, that's something that we just, that's just form and not useful. But think about some of the rituals that have been really powerful for you, and what might happen if one of the people involved in that ritual was not physically or psychologically present. The ways in which that disruption touches you at a really deep place. My mom used to make, at Christmas Eve, she used to make candle salad. And maybe some of you have also been around candle salad. I'll give you the recipe. You want to write this down because it'll show up on your holiday table, I'm sure. But it's a lettuce leaf, and then a pineapple ring, maybe 2, just to provide some stability. And then half a peeled banana stuck in the pineapple ring with a maraschino cherry on top for the flame. So you can picture this, I would imagine. And Mom would make that, and we would just be merciless. Mom, that looks horrible. That's not looking like a candle. That just, ugh. And that was part of her suffering on Christmas Eve, was to be, experience all this pushback from her children. So one year she decided she didn't need to do it. Didn't need that kind of problem. So what did she hear then? Mom, where's the candle salad? And the ritual was not just the candle salad. The ritual was teasing Mom about the candle salad. That's how we said who we were, how we were connected to each other, how we celebrated, and so on. So the disruption of the ritual had this kind of unexpected effect. And I'm guessing that many of you have examples of rituals that have been interrupted or canceled where you were surprised by the impact, surprised by how much it hurt or how sad you felt when the ritual wasn't happening. So when the disruption of a ritual is part of the impact of ambiguity, you can understand how this is the this unwelcome intruder that comes along with ambiguous loss, that says it has impacted even the ways that we celebrate a holiday, a birthday, how we say goodbye and hello to each other. Those are rituals too. It's not just the big things. Rituals are also this daily patterned interaction. When you call someone who you don't live with, how do you start the conversation? When you answer the phone, do you say, yeah? What do you want? Or do you say, hi, how are you? There's the rituals, these little things that we do that tell us, okay, our relationship is in good repair. When those are missing, those daily patterned interactions, it's destabilizing and disorienting for ourselves. That makes sense? So the impact of ambiguity on our roles, our rituals, and our rules are places to watch when we're working with people who are experiencing ambiguous loss. Questions about that, or comments, observations?
I think that especially now, because of the pandemic, a lot of, rituals are based on what we can and can't control.
Mm-hmm.
So, there will be things that obviously we can't do because of the pandemic, which will make other things that we can control even more important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I was struck by that at graduation time in June, May and June, when some schools were being so creative about saying, okay, we can't do our regular ritual, but here's what we'll do instead. a community where each senior walked to the edge of the dock, got their diploma, stepped onto a boat, and they had a boat parade. I mean, that's going to be a memory that, oh, were you the boat parade class? And it will be something special, but it was something different. And so our capacity to reimagine, how do we say who we are and what we believe and how we're connected? How do we do healing and celebration? That requires some creativity and some spacious thinking for us. Other observations or questions about these impacts? Okay. Well, I'd like to invite you to spend just a few minutes in some smaller groups talking about choosing one of those areas, the roles, the rules, or the rituals, to experiment with what kinds of questions might you ask, not solutions to those problems, but what kinds of questions might you ask to determine the kind of impact that ambiguity and ambiguous loss have had on a person or family. So let's do, would 9 groups work, Sherry, at this point?
Sure, we can do whatever we want.
Okay. We can do whatever we want.
Within reason, of course.
So in this case, let's do 9 groups, and then groups 1, 2, and 3, if you would brainstorm some questions about how might you understand the impact of an ambiguous loss on a family, what kinds of questions might you ask? And think as creatively as you can about not just how have your roles been affected, but what would you ask to get at an understanding of how roles have been impacted? What would you ask to get at an understanding of how rules have changed and about how rituals have changed? Okay, so groups 1, 2, and 3, if you look at roles, groups 3, 4, and 5, if you look at rules, and 6, 7, and 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 7, 8, and 9 if you look at rituals. Okay, does that make sense? The task? And then just think about, ask somebody who'd be willing to report back with a couple of questions that you think could be a way at understanding the impact for this family. All right.
We had great discussion, lots of examples from present family situation, but kind of bringing into view, if you were to tell us about your day, what do you see yourself doing throughout the day? When you get up and through the evening, you might comment on what other people you see doing or not doing as you get up, and kind of really seeing that more visual, action-oriented way of understanding how they saw their participation in the family without using the word role. Maybe them offering them like the family a paper with 6 squares and having different words if there were teenagers, like decision, action, question, and having them kind of say who they thought did those different types of things. And then we had really looking at how would you just basically describe what seems different now since there's been this loss. And if you were to do something new in the family, what would you like to do? What do you have a strength that you think would be helpful right now for the family? That's not a great summary for our group. I tried to help.
Those are great questions. The kind of a solution-focused orientation that says, what would you like to have be the case, which is a nice thing to bring about it too. Other comments from anybody who's talking about the family roles?
We started pretty specifically. Since Thanksgiving and Christmas is coming up, we started with, so Thanksgiving's coming up, and what do you usually do? Are you the one that bakes the turkey? Do other people bring side dishes? Do you get help with that? Those kind of things. And then maybe going into where, whose house is it usually held? What do you do afterward? Do you sit around and play football? We just kind of bounced questions off in that way.
Nice, very specific.
Mm-hmm. And there was more that you guys can chime in.
And watching, it strikes me that gives you a chance then to watch the way they respond, not just what they say. like, is there hesitation or is there emotion around that? That you get a lot more information than just the answers to those questions.
Mm-hmm.
Are there possibilities about roles?
We're looked at too that in a lot of families, there's kind of just an underlying assumption that somebody is going to step up and do this role, whether it's the oldest or whether it's this person or that person. And whether identifying, whether is that a good fit, is that realistic, are there other people that can be helping out, what all needs to be done? Are people willing to do it? Who isn't willing or isn't able? And how does that change dynamics within the family, the relationships between people, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Nice. So you have these kinds of questions that are both kind of like before questions. What did you used to do? Who used to do that kind of thing? You have the questions about what would you like to have happen, and also kind of trying to uncover some of the assumptions about who we just figure will do this, rather than being more intentional about that. Great. Okay, how about the groups looking at the rules, 4, 5, and 6? And just all 3 groups, go ahead and just offer what you got.
One of the things we talked about was a lot of the rules are going to be circumstantial to people's situations. For example, a family with young children might have different sets of rules than a retired couple. Mm-hmm. And what we were trying to do is ask questions and get information in a compassionate way, not seem confrontational. So, what is I like the example earlier. What does your day look like? What does the morning look like? What does the afternoon look like? What's the family relationships look like now? Those kinds of questions.
Thank you. Others about the rules.
We talked about kind of like a blurred line between rules and rituals, because sometimes people get so stuck in their rituals that they become rules.
Yeah.
And so then, as we got into what is a rule, we were talking about things like, well, what to say and not to say. For example, at my house, you never talk about politics and religion at a family gathering or whatever, because there's such diverse opinions. We just kind of stay away from it. Other people's homes, you might say, ask, where are people going to sit? Where should they sit? Don't ever put grandma next to Uncle Fred, that type of thing. That's a rule. Alcohol, some people maybe drink too much, and so we're not going to serve alcohol. Maybe at are you going to serve alcohol might be a question. If I'm worried about my loved one and they drink too much when we go to a party with alcohol, I might ask that. Are you going to serve alcohol? Or if I like an occasional glass of wine and I want to see, am I going to be able to have one at your house? I might say, do you serve alcohol at your parties? Another one might be a rule about dietary, because there's someone who has a terrible allergy that could die if they eat something that's mixed with shellfish or peanuts or something like that. So there's a rule, nobody brings a dish that has anything to do with peanuts or shellfish, something like that.
Mm-hmm. So again, the specificity of how do we look at what's happening about those rules on the surface, and then underneath them, what is the implicit rule? Thank you. Other?
We talked about, I have a family member in my family who does not talk to my grandma. And so it's one of my grandma's children, and all of their children also don't talk to the grandma. So we use that specific example. It's an ambiguous loss because that child has lost their mother. There are also a lot of rules because we have a lot of cousins and aunts and uncles, and we need to make sure that, like, if there's a baby shower or a wedding or something like that, the rule is that everybody is invited. And it is your choice whether or not you want to come. The other rule is if so-and-so shows up and so-and-so shows up, they just ignore each other. And so I guess those are 2 rules when it comes to my family in particular. And then something I didn't mention too is that the person who does not talk to their mother also wants support from their siblings, because they get to have a relationship with their mother, and their mother has iced this other person out of the family. She does it quite regularly to every family member. It's just like these few years she ices this person out, and then the next few years it's another person. So they, you know, almost all of them are in agreement that, you know, no matter what you say, no matter what my grandma, the mom, does, that they're not going to listen to her, because she'll try to pin them against each other. And they're no, that's not going to happen. So the rule is everybody's invited. And the other rule is to support this person because they did lose their mother and they still want a relationship with all of the other family members. So it's very tricky, but that's the rule.
Oh yeah, what a great example of the physical presence, psychological absence, and it's also a reflection of the ways that rules oftentimes, like you said, this is a pattern that happens every now and then. She switches the person. So that's the dynamic that we're curious about. What happens underneath the actions on top. So the pattern seems to be, for some reason, every now and then you ice somebody out, and that's how we maintain the kind of connection that feels safe, you know, or it feels comfortable to us.
And it's very strange because there is no reason usually. There is nothing big or crazy happens. It could be that my uncle stops over at my other uncle's house and he's going to the casino and they didn't invite him. So then my grandma will ice my uncle out for years and not speak to him. I mean, it's crazy. So we haven't found the pattern. Like there is no, it's just, I think it's the drama. It's the, I don't know. I guess I don't know what it is. That would be really good to know. But we can't figure it out.
And hence the ambiguity is not just a discrepancy in absence and presence, but it's also the understanding of how this starts and how it stops. So the rules that families develop about how they're supposed to relate to each other and the outside world can be so fascinating unless you're part of it, in which case they're so hurtful and so devastating. But that sense of how do we understand that, and the questions that you have, you know, asking about what to say, what not to say, you know, what would you be nervous of, who, like if you even asked a person or a family to say who would be most upset if, you know, somebody invited both people into the same thing, who would be most open to that? You know, you're doing this kind of circular questioning where you're just asking what would happen if, because you don't know. So it's not the kind of closed question that shuts it down. It really is, I don't know what would happen. I just don't know. And again, you have some indicators here of asking about before and how you feel about how it is now, and what would you like to have be different in the future. Thank you. Any other rule observations that your groups had? Okay, let's talk about rituals. 7, 8, and 9. Whoever from that bunch has something to offer.
Okay, go ahead. One thing that we talked about was asking how this loss, what their vision is of kind of like going through the day, or we spoke, you know, about holidays as well. How do you see, you know, Thanksgiving or Christmas unfolding? What is your vision? And do you think what do you think other people's visions may be? And, you know, how to come together with those visions and make it something that works.
Okay.
We had talked about also the difference in rituals when young children are involved and when they aren't, and just developing awareness of what rituals the family does have. We talked about offering families the idea that they could change rituals or give them permission to discontinue rituals or to take a break from a ritual. Thought we could ask what family members thought what's going to be different in whatever event or holiday is coming up. And asking what would you like to do differently, inviting an opportunity with change to be creative.
Nice. Thank you.
We also talked about really almost having two separate conversations, like Thanksgiving, for an example, going into Thanksgiving, how do I feel now knowing that the ritual is changed or taken away? And then at the back end, after Thanksgiving has happened, now how do I feel having gone through that change and gone through that experience? And also, what can you do to make this change in your ritual a pleasurable experience?
Thank you.
Not to step. Well, we also mentioned about the difference between core and more peripheral or sideline things. What's most important? With religious rituals, for example, with I believe with most Jewish faith groups, it requires a minimum of 10 people to be there. So what do you do with the loss of one? Or with us Christians for whom sacraments are very important, is it legitimate only to receive it from the hand of the minister or the priest? And similarly at family gatherings, do we have to have a turkey? Or I guess somebody brought up about dietary restrictions. Okay, so do we do something in its place, or do we just forego doing that altogether? I think that's a question with that's got a lot of ambiguity to it.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Other ritual questions you thought of? Well, thank you. I, again, just want to kind of highlight the themes that emerged among all the ideas that you have, and which I think are helpful in helping us shape questions as we're trying to assess the impact of ambiguous loss on a group. What was it like before? That can create some emotion sometimes, but it also gives us information about maybe this is not a disrupted ritual or a rule that's being broken because of the ambiguous loss. It was in place before. And so some people might blame the loss on, okay, that ruined everything. Well, maybe things were kind of in flux before. So both getting a sense of what might have been problematic before, but what was really meaningful before in terms of ritual, what was kind of streamlined and helpful and efficient in terms of roles. How did we know what to do in terms of rules, but getting a sense of what was it like? Okay, that's a kind of a helpful shaping theme to think about when you're developing questions about assessing the impact of ambiguous loss. And then what would you like it to be now? What's possible now? Are there that nice way you phrased it just now about the turkey? Are we going to replace that aspect of the ritual, or we can just forego it? And that gives you some information about what actually holds meaning in the present moment, and what would you like to have this look like in the future? Who would you like to be taking on these roles? What kind of rules would you like to renegotiate in the future because of this person who is now ambiguously present or lost to us? And several of you kind of alluded to this sense of how do you feel about that change? The change between what was what is going to be now, so that we're opening up space for people to begin to explore that conflicting kind of emotion and explore the ambivalence. When we talk tomorrow about normalizing ambivalence more deeply, part of it is we have to recognize that we have the ambivalence. And sometimes there are rules about that, in a family or a faith community. It's not all right to feel angry. It's not all right to feel despair, that somehow that's seen as weak or a flaw or a sin. And so being able to hear into a person's or a family's experience of this is how it feels to have this change. And for some, it may be we need to make a space for them to say, you know what, it's better than it was. The ambiguity of the person who was in and out, with addiction or with an affair, that somehow this feels like there's some clarity. And so letting there be space for that, for the unacceptable emotions, the things that people don't feel comfortable saying out loud sometimes. So playing with with questions, open-ended questions that ask about what was it like? What would you like it to be like? How do you feel about that? Those kinds of give us some themes, within which we can develop a whole lot of questions to ask about what the story is of now. Other thoughts? The purpose of assessing the impact of ambiguous loss is not to make a diagnosis. It's not to figure out, okay, now I know what to do. The person is to start, the purpose is to start opening up some space for those who are experiencing the ambiguous loss to start wondering, to be able to move toward that both and aspect of resilience. So there's no need to feel like I got to get the right question that's going to tell me something specific that I need to know, that will then guide my behavior toward this person or this group. But rather to say how it's not just that I understand it, it's that they begin to open up space to understand how this ambiguous loss has impacted these elements of their life together. Other thoughts coming out of that, your discussions? Then I'd like to take a little bit of time to think with you about how the pandemic exacerbates all of this. That we have lived now for 8 or 9 months in this strange upside down time, and now we're moving into, at least in many locations, moving into a colder, darker part of the year, and that's going to change again how we experience the isolation and the caution. So one of you mentioned earlier in the chat about the parishioners who suddenly stop attending, and then does that ambiguous loss affect other ambiguous losses? So I want to do just a quick detour into a refresher on the brain so that we have some common language to think about. So when we think of our human brain, we've got these aspects of it that many of you are very familiar with in your own work. But if you put your hand on the back of your neck, right where your skull meets your neck, that's our reptilian brain. It's a snake and lizard part of our brain. And the reptilian brain is responsible for our instinctive kinds of things, breathing, heart rate. It's necessary. It's not a bad part of our brain. It's just not a very sophisticated part of our brain. So being aware that's where we experience the kind of reaction, the sense of fighting or fleeing. You've heard about that fight, flight, freeze, a response. And they're now identifying even more responses that hit us when we are experiencing a threat. Our reptile brains, our lizards, respond sometimes with kind of collapsing, or with attaching and trying to please. And so those instinctive reactions are ones that are meant to serve us, but don't always in human relationships serve us that well. But it's an important part of our brain. It's just a small part of our brain. So if some of you have been in meetings where all the lizards are gathered together, and lizards don't do well in meetings with each other. So it's like, how do I figure out how do I determine this is my reptilian reaction? Then kind of the part of your brain in the midbrain, the mammalian part of our brain, where we experience things like emotion and nurture, kind of the what we share with mammals like dogs and horses, and some people say cats. I don't know about that, but the playful, emotional sense of our brain. And in there too is hidden the amygdala, which is our fire alarm, which warns us when there's a danger and a threat, and tells the reptilian part of our brain, now do one of those things you're good at, run away or fight or play dead, do something. But then the biggest part of our brain is that the prefrontal cortex and all the thinking part of our brain. So we have the reptilian and the mammalian and the human thinking brain. And that's the purpose of that, is to do our reasoning, our decision making, our information gathering, our memory consolidation, our learning. And so ideally, that part of our brain is kind of the CEO of the rest. So it decides, hopefully we can identify, I'm feeling really, really anxious. My lizard is really alarmed. And our thinking part of our brain says, no, I got this. We'll figure out what to do about this. We're not just going to react. We're going to choose a response. So the thing about the brain is that when we are experiencing a trauma reaction, something that has felt life-threatening to us, or that we watch somebody else experiencing a threat to their very existence, that kind of memory is stored differently in our brains than what we did last weekend. Okay, so when we experience when we have a memory of a trauma event, we experience it as though it's happening now. It feels present to us. That makes sense? So it's not like I could tell you, well, if I had the mental bandwidth right now, I could tell you what I did last weekend in order, and here's what happened, and I wouldn't have a response to that. But when I'm telling you about a trauma experience that I've had, it doesn't stay coherent like that. It's not a memory of back then. It's a feeling of right now. So that's a really important thing to remember, to remember about how our brains are functioning. When we think about then having that trauma event triggered, we experience it as though it's present. So we will act as though it's present, which is we'll fight or flee or play dead, whatever our reaction is. And we end up then living as though we are in threat. Have any of you worked with the adverse childhood experiences material? I would bet that you have. There's a fabulous YouTube video with Nadine Burke, I think. There's another name in there I'm forgetting. But adverse childhood experiences talk about the ways in which certain experiences of danger for children tend to have long-term health impacts for adults. Okay, and there's good solid research about this. The reality of living in stress, under high stress for a long time, is that our bodies are reacting out of the reptilian part of our brain and saying, there's danger here, send out help. So the stress hormones that would be distributed throughout our body in order to help us fight or run away or do whatever is needed to protect ourselves, those stay at a higher level. We are supposed to experience that shot of adrenaline when the saber-toothed tiger is running at us. We experience the adrenaline so we can get away or protect ourselves in some way. But then we're done. It's supposed to dissipate then. And when we are living in constant stress, then our organs, our bodies are soaking in those stress hormones that are meant to be momentary. That's not healthy. So that's why we see these long-term health impacts of kids who have been living in high stress situations where there is abuse or extreme poverty, or a person in the home is incarcerated, or someone in the home is being hit. These kinds of adverse experiences create this hypervigilance, and then that hypervigilance means that that little body is soaking in the things that are supposed to help it, but over long term actually cause harm. And that shapes then long term how the body is reacting and is hanging on to itself, especially when things are triggered. When again the trauma is triggered, those adverse experiences get triggered, then that reactivates that higher stress hormone level. Does that make sense? So we have clear evidence that things that we have tended to call lifestyle diseases, like diabetes, heart disease, that those have roots in, for many people, in adverse childhood experiences. That those experiences shape the body throughout life. So when we are aware of that kind of, this is a physiological thing, right? We're not talking about, oh, the stress that all these things in my mind that I'm remembering I have to do. It is a whole body experience. The stress of the pandemic is a whole body experience. The remembrance of trauma is a whole body experience. And that means it requires whole body responses, whole body nurture, right? Which is sometimes hard to do. I just heard a clip on the morning news about our state, Minnesota, is closing gyms down again on Friday. And the people who are really concerned, who are saying, that's how I'm keeping my mental health. I go to the gym, I work out, I don't know what I'm gonna do. It's cold, I don't know, I can't do what I usually do, and I'm afraid. So mental health suffers, but it's not a mental health problem alone. It is this physiological reality that our bodies are responding to. So that whole body, hold that thought, okay? That we're talking about whole body responses, which means we have these resources available to us, as we always do with physiological stress experiences, of our breath and movement. And I'm saying movement, I'm not saying exercise, because exercise is a 4-letter word times 2. But the sense of how do we use our breath and how do we move our bodies to dissipate the stress hormones? That can be, walking around the house. It can be walking out down the street to, further than we have to pick up the mail. Whatever we can move to get the stress hormones moving through our bodies, because they're not supposed to stop. They're supposed to be in a momentary thing that helps us respond to danger. So move and then breathe. And the breathing part, there are all kinds of recommendations about breathe this way, breathe that way, count this many times, do that. The main thing is under stress to be sure that we're exhaling longer than we're inhaling. Okay, so if you notice, when I tell people, follow your breath. Don't wrestle it to the ground and kill it. It's not like make yourself breathe this many seconds and then hold your breath for this many seconds and then exhale for this many seconds. That serves a purpose with certain kinds of yoga practices, with certain, there's nothing wrong with that, but we don't have to get that complicated. The thing is, if we notice that we're inhaling for 4 seconds, try that. Then exhale for 6. That's the kind of using our breath, that resource that is always with us, to say, how do I help myself to stabilize physiologically in this extreme stress environment? So that's a baseline, okay? So as we think about triggers that happen in a pandemic, we notice this baseline. I need to pay attention to how I'm breathing and that I'm moving to get the stress hormones out, because the stress hormones are responding to the perceived threat. when we find ourselves ramped up and angry about something, oh, now they're making us do this. Now they're not letting us do that. Our anxiety has gotten higher. Our physiological experience of anxiety has gotten higher. So we need to respond physiologically. So here's the other thing about the brain. What fires together wires together. Okay, so when we have these neural pathways that form in our brain, it's because we had an experience and the whole of that experience wires together. So if I'm experiencing someone who's angry with me as a little kid, and when that person is angry with me, they hit me or they hurt somebody that I love, that wires together. So someone's anger wires together with my response of fear. That means, again, this is how our brains are created to function. That means that when we're older and we experience anger, if we're not aware of that response that has been planted in us, then we're going to have fear when we experience anger. Someone who's angry at us makes us scared. Okay? So that neural pathway stuff is what allows us to grow and survive. You have built a lot of neural pathways, any of you who drive, about what certain things mean. If you're driving along and you see an 8-sided red thing, what's your foot going to do? You're going to step on the brake, right? It's like, I know I have this neural pathway that tells me, oh yeah, I see that, my foot does this. You can be car dancing to some great song. You can be arguing with your passenger. I mean, having a nice discussion with your passenger. And you can, and you see that thing and your foot does it anyway, because you had this neural pathway built. That's really useful. It'd be horrible if we had to determine every time we went outside, what does that mean? What do I do now? So this is good shorthand for us. It also serves us less well when we get a trigger or an echo of something that was dangerous before. So in the pandemic, when you hear, that things you're going to be isolated more. Well, if you were isolated in the past and that turned out to be painful, that's going to trigger something, which is going to ramp up the stress, right? I was noticing a couple months ago how sad I felt when I would hear that a little, shop that I liked to shop in was closing, or a restaurant was closing for good, or a little coffee shop was, just shutting their doors. And I would feel so inordinately sad. I thought, this is kind of crazy, Carla. This is, you don't have to have such a big reaction. And then it occurred to me that when Mom died, I didn't get to say goodbye to her. She was gone. And so when I'm having this experience in the pandemic that things are just gone, it triggers that neural pathway that says, oh, things disappear suddenly and it causes great grief. Okay, so that's not a strange thing. It's not an overreaction. It's a triggering of a neural pathway. And that's happening a lot for us in the pandemic, that we're getting old grief triggered. We're getting old hurts triggered. We're having echoes of those. And I don't know that there's anything quite as powerful of a trigger as for ambiguous loss as the kind of ambiguity that we're living in right now. There is so little that we know for sure. There is so little that we have clear information about. And so any reminder of that, which is pretty much daily for most of us, will have the potential to trigger those other ambiguous losses that either are in our past or that we're currently experiencing. That's not a flaw. That does not mean that you haven't done your work about grief, or that you haven't resolved something, or that you're not being resilient. It means you're human. And the human experience is that we have echoes and triggers, and that is what connects us to our whole story. The story of our past, the fears we have for our future, what's happening to us right now. So it is, I think, really understandable that a whole lot of us are finding ourselves living with echoes and triggers of traumatic stress and of ambiguous loss. questions about that or comments?
The comment that I had when you were talking about, you know, the childhood traumas and how it affects people is how we know that disease, diabetes and heart disease are familial, but it's maybe not just genetics.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's a really helpful addition. Because it does, you know, our bodies, because again, we're whole people, our bodies are shaped by our relationships. So when we have stress in relationships, especially early in life, that shapes our bodies, shapes the ways that our genes are expressed. Remember, the saying is, you know, we don't have a gene program, we have a gene pool. And so what gets expressed out of our gene pool, our genetic pool as an individual, has a lot to do with our kinds of relationships that we're part of and the kind of anxiety that we live with. So that longer term impact of those early childhood experiences is physiological, and it's also learned. I mean, think about this. If you're a little kid and you're living in a chronically high stress family, where there's a lot of danger and perhaps a lot of abuse, and you learn that you don't have any capacity to protect yourself, that people in your environment are going to hurt you. They're going to misuse you physically, misuse you sexually, misuse you spiritually or emotionally. And that kind of helplessness is what the world is like. Then even as an adult, when you hear, well, you know, you have prediabetes, and so if you take some action, you could stave off the formal diagnosis perhaps. That's really running counter to what wired together, which is I don't have control over my body. I can't protect my body. So really, you're telling me that if I eat differently and do exercise, that's going to protect me? Well, it never did. And so it's the genetic stuff, it's the early physiological learning, and it's then that belief that we have that we learn. So we have to kind of challenge again those learnings that say, well, maybe I do have the capacity to protect myself that I didn't before. There's a note in the chat about The Body Keeps a Score by Bessel van der Kolk, fabulous resource. There are some people doing such good work on trauma and the physiological nature of trauma. Bessel van der Kolk is one, Peter Levine is another, Deb Dana is a great one, Diane Poole Heller. These are people who are really working hard to help us understand the long-term effects of early experiences and how we can heal. This is not, remember, our history is only influential, it's not determinative. So whether that's trauma or ambiguous loss, it has an influence, but it's not determinative. So our history is not our destiny, you know. Other observations or questions?
A lot of what you're talking about now with the childhood early effects reminds me of the trauma recovery program that a person here in Kalamazoo has put together and has been teaching adults how the trauma from their youth have affected how they behave as adults.
Yeah, it's really important programming, important learning. We can learn this. The stuff that we learned early, you know, it's like I speak English now because I grew up learning it. I also speak shame now because I grew up learning shame. So how do I learn a new language? You know, that becomes the question, and providing resources for helping people. Again, remember that all this is important story stuff, it's influential, and there is the potential to move in a different direction, to write a different next chapter. Other thoughts, questions? So does it make some sense about why the pandemic can feel even heavier to us? You know, it's not just, I mean, it would be enough if we were having these, restrictions and cautions and losses, and the ambiguity of losses. How are my friends doing? How are my family members doing? I don't see them. They're physically absent to me, but psychologically very, very present. So it's understandable enough if we just look at the present. But when we also take into account the triggers and echoes that are part of our past, we need to be incredibly gentle with ourselves and compassionate to ourselves about what it's like to live in this time of intense ambiguity.
I think it makes a whole lot of sense, Dr. Dahl. And I love that word echo. I've heard triggers a lot. Echoes they're so much more subtle, but they're there. And it's a good definition of those things that they just kind of nag. It's not like a trigger that's going to put me all the way over, but it's just something heavy or that's there. And that's a really cool word that I think really helps explain some of what a lot of us are feeling right now.
Good. And they remember that those, again, the neural pathways help us understand that certain seasons hold those echoes for us, certain anniversaries. I mean, I think as humans, we are rhythmic people. We respond to what's happening, and it's why Sabbath matters, that we respond to this rhythm of life. And so seasons, the change of seasons reminds us of things. We hear echoes of those people who are ambiguously lost to us, or our experiences, our dreams that are ambiguously lost to us. The holidays, certain holidays can have those echoes. That again, that's our whole self paying attention to what's part of our life. And that is not an indicator of less than or inadequacy or, well, you should have done that better. Here's another thing. How about rhyme as well? Yeah, this kind of has a rhyme to it. And, if you haven't looked much into the field of self-compassion, I would encourage you to do so. Not long ago, like a few years ago, there may be 15 or 17 research studies about self-compassion, which is defined as holding ourselves with tenderness, recognizing that human suffering is part of everyone's life and experience. It's not because we have failed in some way. And then turning toward what is painful without judging it. Okay, so those three things: holding ourselves with tenderness, reminding ourselves of our humanity, the human experience, and then being able to turn toward without judging. In the past, 6 or 7 years, there are probably now close to 2,000 research projects about self-compassion, and the findings are amazingly consistent. It increases compassion, it increases generosity, it increases motivation. The things that some of us, back away from, self-compassion, that sounds selfish and kind of, poor me. It's not that. Self-compassion defined that way, holding ourselves with tenderness and kindness, like we would hold somebody else who's suffering, reminding ourselves of our humanity, and then being able to not to turn toward without judging. That those increase the things that so many of us value, our connection to other people and the ways in which we live generously in the world. So part of our, the intentionality around living well in the pandemic, I think really is supported by the self-compassion that we're able to hold ourselves with, because this is really a difficult time. I ordered a sweatshirt yesterday that said, "I miss precedented times." I don't want any more unprecedented times. There are just too many. So thinking about, how we live with this part of our story in ways that are kind and compassionate, not just to each other, but to ourselves. We have had an offer from a person who was willing to talk about their story with ambiguous loss and share that experience with us. And he will introduce himself to you and share his story. And I would just encourage you to hold him with kindness and tenderness as he shares us his story with us. And also with confidentiality, he can let you know how much he would be comfortable with you sharing this beyond. But I would generally say that if we're hearing each other's stories, we are these kind of sacred containers. We hold the story. And so do that with all the goodwill and tenderness that you can muster.
Yep, and he's with us now.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Lon, take it away.
Oh, okay. First of all, I appreciate this opportunity to tell a little bit of my story in hopes that it might help others. I realize our audience today is primarily those in ministry in trying to, I think in ministry, trying to provide spiritual support to those living with mental illness and families of those living with mental illness. Am I correct in this understanding of audience?
We have a wide variety of folks. We have professionals, we have caregivers, and we have faith leaders. Yep.
Okay. So in order to talk about ambiguous loss and how I have approached that and dealt with it in the course of my life, I'm going to have to set the stage a little about who I am. So, because that's what we bring to all the challenges of life. So I hope I can get through this in a meaningful way. And I guess I would start by saying, hi, my name is Lon. I have alcoholism. That's how I introduce myself at AA meetings. I don't say I'm an alcoholic, as many do, because I differentiate the disease from my sense of I am. Those words, I am, have great meaning for me. Biblically, that's God. So similarly, I don't say I'm a diabetic, I say I have diabetes. That being said, I also don't say I am a bipolar disorder or I am a borderline personality disorder. Those are diseases that I have. I've learned that I'm not my diseases and I'm not my symptoms. And that may be an important distinction for you to share with people who are struggling. I am not my symptoms was something I didn't learn until the last year or two of my life. And because I have these mood swings and I have these symptoms that come out of the blue that seem to have complete no rhyme or reason, no control over them, it's really important for me to remember that this is just a passing storm. I am not my symptoms. Anyway, maybe my symptoms have me instead of me having them, but that's another debate altogether. What I can tell you after a lot of therapy and prayer is that people can and do manage to live with mental illness and with ambiguous loss. I think it's harder for people with mental illness to deal with ambiguous loss because we already are uncertain about how the world works, how our mind works, how love and loss works. When facing one or more of the diseases of the mind or the grief process triggered by ambiguous loss, it's helpful to know that there are others who understand and will support you. So that too is almost hard to believe in the middle of the storm, as it were, but it's true. And knowing that has helped me persevere through some dark times. I tell my stories like this because it may help those like me on the inside of the mental illness experience to know they're not alone. I also hope it will help those on the outside who love somebody who struggles. Perhaps my shared experience will give them a glimpse inside of what their family member is going through. There is hope, but I digress. I'm trying to watch my time here. Not only do I live with mental illness, but I have family members who live with various diagnoses. My father had what was diagnosed many years ago as borderline schizophrenia. Today, they would say borderline personality disorder. My daughter is a recovering heroin addict who's also bipolar. She's been clean, sober, and well for a couple of years now, but she went through a really dark time. There, too, we have the sense of losing someone, even though they're still there. My daughter was still there, but she wasn't my daughter anymore when she was using. We didn't even know what was going on until almost it was over, but we knew that we didn't have the daughter we raised and loved. Anyway, I have a son who's bipolar and he's not sure what gender he belongs to. Actually, he's sure he's non-binary. Some of you may know what that means. Living with these family members has been challenging, but I have learned to accept their struggles and love them through the hard times. Sometimes, even though I can do it for others, it's harder to extend that same grace to myself. It's hard to accept my mood swings, my black and white life and death thinking. It's harder to shrug off the unwanted thoughts and suicidal ideas that occur and learn to say while meditating and a thought comes in that we didn't want, that happened, and then get back to whatever's going on around us in the present moment. You know, these are struggles that I deal with. When struggling with mental illness or loving someone who does, I've worn both shoes, it's common to believe that the situation is so unique, so scary, so filled with unmentionable acts and thoughts that no one else will understand. We can't talk to anybody. Well, I'm here to tell you that this is not true. For those who suffer or love someone, you're not alone. For those who have tried to minister to someone and found it overwhelming, you too are not alone. As Solomon once said, there's nothing new under the sun. Life is all vanity, a chasing of the wind, as we get from the good book. Whether living with mental illness or loving someone who struggles, it's important to know that diagnosis is not a terminal sentence. There is hope. NAMI encourages getting professional help in the form of therapy and spiritual support. NAMI also facilitates community and social support. For those in the helping professions, there's a message of certitude from me on the inside that healing will come in its own time if you just love the suffering until they finally find their way. I found that that is the answer, and loving myself until I find my way has also been both a monumental challenge and, in my best moments, a finding of great peace. So today, I want to share a little bit about myself, my struggles, my experience, and the hope I find in prayer that allows me to release these things to God. Some in Christian circles would say, lay my burdens at the cross. Others in maybe Buddhist circles would say suffering ends when one accepts that suffering is inevitable. In other words, we stop fearing it and fighting it. That fearing and fighting the suffering does not help. It just makes it that much worse. So I could tell you a long, gory story about my childhood, but I don't think it's going to fit in today. I had a difficult upbringing. My dad was a military man. We didn't know what he was doing because he was working in the Army on the nuclear missile program. He designed the control boards and software that ran the missile silos and radar guidance systems for intercontinental ballistic missiles. Of course, he couldn't talk about it. So what we knew about Dad and what he did in the world was pretty much nothing. He was in the Army. That's all we knew. As a result, I came to know that fathers were mysterious and unknowable. He was also a binge drinker with rage issues, which made him unpredictable. Sometimes he loved, sometimes he threw thunderbolts of judgment that left permanent scars on my soul. In growing up like this, you form a broken concept of God. I learned a lot from the Old Testament preaching in church and Sunday school, and this was most certainly how God was. Supposed to be loving, but he could swallow people up in the earth or throw thunderbolts or strike people dead. So my image of God as a father in heaven was very distorted. Dad didn't go to church, but my mother and 3 sisters and I did. Mother tried to counter Dad's hard nature with her gentleness, but she too was a victim of his rage. So we children learned incorrectly that evil was more powerful than love, and love is not enough. I learned from my father that I was special because I was a boy. We men had to stick together, but I also learned that I was a punching bag. Every grace, like being chosen to go fishing with him, girls weren't allowed in that club, could lead to abuse. One day we were fishing and we hadn't had a good day catching bass, the holy grail of, all Texas fishermen. So we were heading back to the dock, and suddenly my dad stopped the boat in the middle of the lake. I didn't know it, but he had seen a huge school of bluegill on the fish finder. He told me in a special, suddenly tender and mysterious voice, put a cricket on a hook, add a bobber, and throw it in. So I did. Pretty soon I had a monster bluegill on the line. We spent the next hour catching big bluegills, one after the other. It was a really special time for a while. But then he put on his new fancy curved sunglasses. And every time I cast my line, the curved glass apparently made it seem to him like my hook was whipping dangerously past his face. After a couple warnings that I just didn't understand because it wasn't happening, he suddenly started whipping me in the head and face with the long end of his fishing rod. I was the one who ended up with a fish hook in my neck. So I pretty much learned that all grace and favor was to be accompanied by a heavy price to pay soon after. I learned to fear and obey. I learned to pay special attention to his mood, to know what was going on at all times. It seemed like a matter of survival, even life or death. So when we did what children do, like one day I forgot to take the trash out before dinner, I could be punched and beaten to the ground for it. He used to always threaten to skin us alive and hang our hides on the garage to dry. He promised us he would salt our skins to help them dry faster, just like he used to do with alligators he hunted in Florida when he was younger. We believed him. We thought this was normal. Children do. We lived one mistake away from deadly consequences, and I learned that God was sure to punish any transgression. Whenever he needed an extra set of hands, like to work on a car or build a bookcase, he would call me in to help. It wasn't a question or invitation, it was a command. Of course, in the process, I would hand him the wrong nails or the wrong size socket wrench or something, and I would get shouted and have things thrown at me how I was useless and would never amount to anything. It seemed like God was saying the same thing in all that Old Testament preaching, so I took it to heart. I was doomed to do the work assigned to me, to try, but never succeed. But school was an area where I could do well. I got good grades. I was smart. Later, I learned I had an IQ that's borderline genius. I got good grades. I was always the one selected for school play announcer. Apparently, I had a big voice and they trusted me to memorize all the lines. There were a few memorable teachers along the way who paid special attention to me and encouraged me with the idea that success was possible if I applied myself. They may have set the stage for an eventual hope in the loving support of God, but that was a long time off. I joined the Army. They chewed me up to get away from the house. They chewed me up and spit me out. I spent a couple of years in the Army and VA mental hospitals after that. I was diagnosed as schizophrenic. I was suffering from depression. And if my dad had taught me I was useless, the military now taught me I was weak, unwanted, and broken. Yahoo, ain't life great? So to fast forward, after discharge, I spent some time living in the basement of my mother's house, suffering from depression, long battles of just overwhelmed uselessness. I couldn't do anything, had no energy, had no interest in anything. My mother started dating a man who owned a company. This man was kind and gentle and strangely consistent. He was always the same. He believed in good. He believed in the good of all people. He always believed things would turn out okay. And he believed in me. And that's all it took. He gave me a job in his company, in the factory. Under his leadership, I flourished. He allowed wobble room. Wow, that was weird. He didn't beat me up every time I made a mistake. Our little company happened to be in the right place in time when the fad swept the country. We had so many orders we couldn't keep up. I went into him one day and said, hey, if we can't keep up, why don't we raise the prices? People might order less, but we could ship faster in their eyes, and we'd make more money too. He paused for a minute, smiled, and said, I like the way you think. Wow, I hadn't heard that for a long time. I was promoted for that and for automating the manufacturing processes and speeding up assembly. When the office needed help on the phones, I was promoted to sales. I had some ideas for new products that succeeded, and I was promoted to vice president of marketing. Eventually, I was named CEO, heir apparent to run the business someday when he would no longer be with us. He became my mentor in business, teaching me many great lessons in wisdom and practical business administration. He taught me to read and understand and manage a business using balance sheets and income statements. He later trusted me to computerize the business. That was a big deal for him. He was old school. Eventually, I was voting his shares and running the company. The point is, someone believed in me, and that's all it took. I told you all of that so I could tell you this. My stepfather was bodily present for many years, long after his physical strength, mind, and personality even were pretty well gone. It was difficult to watch my former mentor, once a strong and brilliant man, become so diminished at the end. His physical strength declined until he was using a walker and then a wheelchair. He couldn't be left alone because he might fall or he might light the stove and start something cooking and then forget about it. He got where he could no longer do math or even read balance sheets and business reports. Sometimes, on rare occasions, he was there, present enough to fuss and be angry about me being called over to watch him so my wife could, his wife could go take care of some family need. He would be angry. I don't need a babysitter, he would say. And it was kind of hard to take that anger from a man who had always been so supportive and consistent. I found myself wanting to say thank you and goodbye to the man my stepfather once was. But the man who was present would not have understood. Think about that for a minute. He's there, but I couldn't share what I wanted to share because he wouldn't get it. So resolution came when I learned that gratitude could be expressed to a higher power. My spiritual faith had evolved over the many years, thanks in large part to his belief in me. And what I want to leave you all with is that when you're dealing with someone struggling with ambiguous loss, they need to know you believe that there is a better day coming. They need to know that you have seen this before. They need to know that they can talk about anything. They need to know they can share their horrible fears. I almost wish he was dead, I thought sometimes, and who could I tell that to? So resolution came when I learned that gratitude could be expressed to higher power for both the former and latter states of the life and death of this beloved man. I was gratitude for the former states wherein I learned from him how to be a man, how to be a father, how to persevere in difficult times without throwing up my hands and just saying, there it is, proof again, I'm useless. And then I learned to be grateful for the latter states of his life. He gave so much to so many for so long that we, those who loved him, had a chance to give back. And even though we really couldn't know in this life if he would ever understand, even though he was humiliated at needing, diapers changed and food fed to him, sometimes he was aware enough to be humiliated by those things. But other times he was just, conversational in the moment, at least on a 10 or 15 minute loop. And one could try to relive old memories or have conversations about the weather and remember the good days too. So in the end, the chance to serve helped to move me from the idea that God was demanding and unforgiving and lightning bolts were around every corner and that loss was just going to happen and I had no power over it. I came to accept. I came to lay my burdens at the cross. I came to accept that God is love, that he has our best in mind always, that short-term difficulties are temporary, and the refiner's fire produces the purest gold. So that's what I've got for you today. I hope it was on topic enough. I don't know if you want to do questions or call it a wrap.
Thank you so much, Lon, for that brave story. We can hear in it the ambivalence that we've talked about earlier this morning, the longing to say something to somebody who's not there in the way that they used to be. And I'm curious if any of you do have some comment or affirmation for Lon or question for him.
I apologize if that wasn't quite what was anticipated.
No apology.
No apology. I accept everything that you said, and it's given me a lot of clarity on some of the things that I've had to embrace in life. And not only that, the courage for you to come forth and share this with us has very been impactful too. And I appreciate everything that you've said about your story. And I just pray that everything continues to go well for you.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing, Lon.
Yes, thank you for sharing your story.
It's healing for me too, to help break the stigma, which I too suffer from. It's easy to stigmatize oneself. I still struggle. I still battle with depression. I still battle bipolar. I take a lot of medication. I get a lot of therapy. I find, and you may find others who will rebel against the church. I found in some ways that I graduated from the church. And this is not an uncommon theme in modern spirituality. I don't know if any of you read Father Richard Rohr, but he's got an interesting series on some of those things. He's a Catholic priest. He's not sure why he's still a Catholic priest, but they still let him preach, even though he talks about Buddha and Eastern thought. You know, Jesus was raised in an Eastern culture. People forget that, and they want to say, oh, you can't get outside the church, or you can't get outside the Bible for philosophy or wisdom or thinking, ways to find ways through life. But, you know, God is God. There is a supreme one, and he one of my favorite passages from any book is from the book The Shack. And in that, a fella asks a supposedly incarnate Christ who he's encountering in a dream or vision. He said, what about this Jesus is the only way thing? What about that? I don't like that. That's what keeps me away from church. And this supposed incarnate Christ, who happened to be an young Asian woman, by the way, this supposed incarnate Christ answered, well, you do believe there is a God, yes? He said, yes. And she says, well, do you think God is all powerful? Said, well, probably. He said, well, do you think an all powerful God could travel any path to meet a seeker? Blew me away, blew all my fundamental Bible thumping, early religious training away. And today I'm there. I'm like, you know, God's in charge. We have to accept, and we have to accept victories as well as losses. I can say that today. I guess I'm having a good day. Some days that's a lot harder, and I need people to remind me of that. So bless you in your work.
I think it's important for us to remember to share with people with mental health and with their families, as you so eloquently put, that there are many success stories, that it is able to live with mental health and live a good life. Because in the midst of it, the person and their families are sometimes in such despair, and they need to know that there's hope. And thank you for sharing that today.
Thank you, my pleasure. I am curious if there's a recording of this that I'll be able to get, and whether or not it will be public.
Yep, we're recording this.
Okay. I kind of like to see what I said. And I know we may post this to the NAMI site. I've crossed a bridge where I guess I have to say I'm comfortable with what I've said, and I wouldn't share it if I wasn't. So again, thank you all for what you do, and thank you for helping me share my story.
Thank you very much, Lon.
Thank you. And thank you for the ways in which you identified so many paths of healing, that there are. We need to be grateful for the multitude of ways that we can find growth and resolution and repair and healing. So thank you so much for offering to do this, and for you'll notice that in the chat, there are a lot of people expressing gratitude for.
Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah.
Sorry. Well,
Take a
thank you, Carla. My pleasure.
Sherry, do you have any last instructions around attendance or that before we end this morning?
Yeah, if you could put your name and organization in the chat box again, that would be helpful, especially if you want CEUs. If you're not, worried about continuing education units, then you don't have to do that, but that would be helpful. Thank you. And other than that, it's the same link for tomorrow. So you can just go to the same email that I sent yesterday, and we'll see you in the morning.